Welcome to Lives Beneath History. Marcus walks at the head of a rain-soaked patrol, bronze helmet bowed beneath the weight of water and duty. In the early years of Rome's expansion into the lands of the Senones, along the cold valleys of northern Italy, he serves as one of many soldiers sent to secure ground that resists their presence. He carries his shield and javelin with the certainty taught to him since boyhood, believing the road ahead can be held by discipline alone. This is his story. The drops of rain pinged off Marcus' bronze helmet and slid down the curve of the metal before spilling over the rim and onto his brow. Water crept under the edge of the cheek guards and ran along his jaw. His red cloak, darkened by the storm, clung to his shoulders and tugged at his neck with every step. The wool had grown heavy, and he could feel the weight of it pressing against the back of his armor. The wind came down the valley in uneven gusts, slipping through the thinning leaves of beech and oak, and carrying with it the damp smell of turned earth. It pushed against his shield and found its way through the seams of his clothing. The cold reached his fingers first. He tightened his grip on his slim javelin and shifted his shield slightly to ease the strain in his forearm, but the numbness remained. Behind him, 6 Romans followed in a loose file along the muddy track. Their sandals made a sucking sound each time they lifted a foot from the churned ground. Marcus did not need to look back to know they were as miserable as he was. He heard their breathing and the occasional muttered complaint carried forward by the wind. At least he walked in the lead. The mud ahead of him was untouched except for the shallow prints he left behind. The men behind him had no such relief. They stepped into the mess he stirred up, sinking deeper with each pace. It was a small advantage, but he counted it as one. The track narrowed as it approached a copse of trees. The ground there rose gently, and the path bent out of sight around a low shoulder of earth. Marcus slowed his pace. His eyes moved from the track to the trees and back again. The trunks were close together, their branches still thick enough to break up the view. He imagined how he would place men if he meant to catch a patrol off guard. He would hide them where the path narrowed and the ground forced the enemy into a tighter formation. He would wait until the first man had passed the bend and then strike at the middle, trapping the rest. The Senones knew this ground better than he did. They had melted away into it for weeks now, appearing only to strike supply wagons or small foraging parties. Marcus had seen what they left behind. The bodies were never arranged with care. They were scattered, stripped of anything useful, sometimes marked by rough cuts that served no purpose but to make a point. He hated them for it. The hatred was not something he examined closely. It was as familiar to him as the weight of his helmet. He had grown up hearing stories of Gallic raids and Roman revenge. His uncle Rubius had told him of a village taken after a hard march, of finding a heap of Roman heads displayed on stakes. Rubius had spoken without trembling, describing how they had burned the houses and cut down every fighting man they found. Marcus had been a boy then, listening wide-eyed, feeling pride rise in him like heat from a forge. It had seemed simple. The Gauls were enemies. Rome endured because men like Rubius, and now, himself, did what needed to be done. He had not yet felt doubt on this campaign into the lands of the Senones. He had seen Gauls die under Roman blades, and had not lost sleep over it. He told himself that was strength. He raised his hand and halted the patrol. The men behind him stopped at once. They had been together long enough to read his gestures without question. Marcus listened. At first he heard only the wind moving through leaves and the faint drip of water from branch to branch. Then there was something else. A rustling, not steady like the wind, but uneven. It might have been a deer startled by their approach. The forests here held plenty of game, but it might not. He lowered his hand and motioned for the men to spread out. 2 moved left, slipping between the trees with shields angled outward. 2 more went right, careful to keep their footing on the slick ground. The last pair remained a few paces behind Marcus, ready to follow his lead. He felt a brief measure of approval. They were not veterans of long campaigns, but they were steady. They kept formation, even in the rain. He adjusted his helmet and took a step forward into the copse. The ground under the trees was softer, layered with wet leaves. His sandals sank quietly. He held his javelin ready, his shield slightly raised. The rustling came again, closer now. He focused on the space between 2 trunks where the path curved. He thought of how he would signal the charge if figures emerged. It was the last clear thought he formed. The impact came from behind and to his left, a sudden force that drove the air from his lungs. He did not hear the throw. The heavy javelin tore through the linen layers beneath his armor, punched through flesh and bone, and forced its way out through his chest. For a moment he did not understand what had happened. He looked down and saw the iron tip protruding just below his collarbone, slick with rain and blood. His fingers loosened around his own weapon. A dull pressure filled his chest, and then his legs gave way. The mud met him with a wet sound. The world narrowed to the taste of iron in his mouth and the cold seeping into his cheek. He did not hear the full clash that followed. Around him the grove erupted. More javelins flew from concealed positions, thudding into shields and bodies. A Roman cried out sharply and then was cut off. Another stumbled, trying to turn toward the trees from which the attack had come, only to meet a rush of bare-chested men surging forward with long swords and oval shields painted in dull patterns. The Senones had waited with patience, crouched among roots and brush despite the rain soaking their hair and cloaks. They had chosen the bend precisely as Marcus would have. One of the Romans fell immediately, struck in the throat. Another dropped his shield and tried to crawl toward the track, dragging one leg uselessly behind him. He did not make it far. A broad man with thick arms and a scar across his ribs stepped in front of him and brought his sword down in a single, practiced stroke. The blade bit cleanly, separating head from shoulders. The body jerked once and lay still. The broad man's name was Pelkos. He had taken Roman heads before. He did not count them carefully, but he knew this was not the first. His heart hammered in his chest as the brief fight ended. The remaining Romans were dead or dying. One of his own lay among them, a spear through his side, breath bubbling weakly. Pelkos glanced at him and then away. The man would not last. There was no time to dwell. He stood over the fallen Roman who had led the patrol. The red cloak was soaked and muddied, but it was good wool. Pelkos bent with a grunt, feeling the ache in his hips from crouching too long in the cold, and grabbed a fold of the cloak. He wiped his blade along it, cleaning away the thicker streaks of blood. The rain would take care of the rest. He straightened slowly. His back protested the movement. He was not young anymore. The years of fighting, marching, and labor in fields had settled into his joints. He scanned the grove to be certain no Roman still moved with purpose. Satisfied, he lifted his arm and waved toward the line of Senones waiting along the track behind the trees. They had not all joined the initial rush. Some had held back to block any escape or to watch for a larger Roman force. They stepped forward now, boots and bare feet alike sinking into the mud. Pelkos' breathing slowed. The rush of battle faded, leaving behind a steady awareness of the work still to be done. The bodies had to be stripped of useful gear. Iron was valuable. Bronze fittings could be reused. The Romans carried coin at times, though not always on patrol. He nudged the fallen leader with his foot and then crouched again to inspect the armor more closely. The javelin that had killed the man had been thrown with skill. It had struck between the plates and passed cleanly through. Pelkos grasped the shaft and pulled it free with a wet sound. He would reclaim the weapon. Good iron was not to be wasted. He studied the Roman's face briefly. The man was younger than he had expected. His beard was still thin along the jaw. Pelkos wondered, not for the first time, how many different kinds of Romans there were. He had heard stories from traders who had traveled south and east to lands where Roman envoys passed through ports like Syracuse and Tarentum. They said Rome was vast, full of districts and crowded markets, temples and houses built close together. Pelkos had never seen it. He had traveled far enough to know the sea's edge and the feel of foreign stone under his sandals. But Rome itself remained a distant name. He had listened when other Senones returned from journeys, sharing cups of Etruscan wine or thick Gallic beer, telling of wide roads and disciplined soldiers. He had wondered whether the men they killed here were farmers, sons like himself once had been, or city men who had never tilled soil. It made little difference now. The Romans had come into Senones land in strength. They built camps with straight ditches and sharp stakes. They cut timber and demanded grain. Pelkos had watched from the edge of a clearing weeks ago as a Roman column moved past, shields polished even under gray skies. He had felt then a steady anger, not loud but firm. This was his valley. His father had hunted here. The Romans marched as if it already belonged to them. He did not need speeches to tell him what to do. The ground itself seemed to demand defense. He rose again and called out short instructions. 2 younger men moved to collect the Roman shields, testing their weight. Another began cutting straps from armor. The fallen Senones warrior groaned faintly. Pelkos went to him and knelt. The wound was deep, the iron head still lodged in his side. Pelkos pressed a hand briefly to the man's shoulder. There were no words that would change the outcome. He had seen such wounds before. The man's breathing grew shallow. Pelkos stood and stepped back. The rain fell steadily, washing the blood into thin streams that mixed with the mud. He looked once more at the Roman leader lying face down. The red cloak, now torn and smeared, lay half beneath him. Pelkos considered taking the head. It was a practice among some of his people, a sign of victory and warning. He had done it before, yet he hesitated. The Romans would return to this track soon enough. They would see the bodies where the heads were taken or not. They would understand the message. Taking the head required time, and time was not always available. He weighed the choice as he had weighed others over the years. Practical concerns guided him more than display. Finally, he signaled to one of the younger warriors, who stepped forward with a knife. The work was done quickly. Pelkos did not watch closely. His thoughts had already shifted to what would follow. The Romans would send more patrols. They would march in larger numbers, shields locked tighter, scouts thrown farther ahead. They would build stronger camps. This valley would see more blood before the season turned. He felt no triumph, only a steady readiness. The ache in his hips reminded him that he was not invincible. Each fight could be his last, as easily as it had been for the man in the red cloak. He glanced once more at the fallen Roman's face before it was taken away. For a moment, he wondered if the man had family who would hear of his death only as a name on a list, or perhaps not at all. He dismissed the thought. Such concerns belonged to other times, other places. Here, survival was the measure. He wiped rain from his eyes and turned toward the line of Senones waiting on the track. "They will come again," he said simply. It was not a boast. It was an acknowledgement. The men nodded. They understood. Pelkos adjusted his grip on his long sword and began to walk back along the muddy path, already considering where next they might wait, which bend or narrow stretch would favor them, and how long they could hold before the weight of Rome pressed too heavily upon their land. Marcus's name was never carved into marble, nor spoken in the Senate, yet his blood darkened the same earth that ambitious men claimed in Rome's name. Their histories remember campaigns, treaties, and the rise of cities, but not the quiet patrols that vanished between one report and the next. In the mud of a narrow forest track, his life ended as countless others did, without ceremony, without witness, beyond those who stood close enough to see. Empires are built from such moments, though they seldom pause to reckon with them. Beneath the triumphs and defeats recorded in careful script lie the ordinary lives that bore their weight. Thank you for listening to Lives Beneath History.